They gave me a number when they took me. And I have forgotten my name. This is not metaphor or poetic flourish. I genuinely cannot recall what my mother called me in those brief years before the press gangs came through Hive Tertius. The number is easier. The number is all the ship needs from me. And the ship's needs have become my own. 4719. Engine deck Gamma. Thrall classification expendable. The designation fits me like the radiation suit they issue each shift, which is to say poorly, with gaps at the seams where the killing light creeps through. I am writing this in the moments between shifts, scratching words into the soft metal of my sleep rack with a sliver of shielding I pried loose from a dead man's boot. The Enginseers would flay me for damaging ship property, but I will be dead before they find these words, and perhaps someone will read them, and perhaps they will understand what it means to live inside the radiation zone of a Voidship's engine. The warmth was the first thing I noticed when they marched us down into the depths. We had come from the frozen underhive, where heat was a luxury hoarded by the powerful, where children died with frost in their lungs and warmth meant survival. So when that first wave of engine heat rolled over me, I wept. I am not ashamed to admit this. Several of us wept. We thought we had been delivered into paradise. The press gang officer laughed at us, I remember. He was a void-born man with radiation scars already mapping his face, and he laughed and said nothing, and I understand now that his silence was a mercy. Let us have that moment of false hope. Let us feel the warmth before we learned what it cost. Engine deck Gamma runs the length of the ship's midsection, a cathedral of brass and iron and pulsing plasma conduits that stretches nearly 2 kilometers from bow to stern. The ceilings vanish into darkness, cluttered with pipes and cables, festooned with devotional banners so old their prayers have faded to illegible ghosts. Everything hums. The vibration enters through your feet and never leaves. It colonizes your bones, your teeth, the space behind your eyes where thoughts used to form clearly. After 3 months I stopped noticing the hum. After 6 months I started to miss it when it changed pitch, the way you might miss a heartbeat. The plasma drives that propel this vessel through the void require constant attention from thousands of hands, and those hands belong to us. The thralls, the expendable ones, the warm bodies that stand between the machine and entropy. My first duty assignment was slag clearance in Section 14, where the coolant systems regularly fail and the reactor runoff pools in iridescent puddles that smell of copper and ozone. We worked in teams of 12, shoveling the crystallized waste into carts that other thralls hauled to the processing vents. The suits they gave us were supposed to last a full shift. Most lasted half that. You learned to watch your dosimeter badge, a small square of reactive cloth pinned to your chest that changed color as you absorbed the invisible poison. White meant safe. Yellow meant caution. Orange meant your shift was over. Red meant you were already dying. I saw my badge go orange on the 3rd day, and I was terrified, but the shift overseer simply noted it in his log and sent me back to work. I did not understand then. The badge was not a warning for our protection. The badge was inventory management, tracking how much death each thrall had absorbed, measuring us towards some threshold I did not yet comprehend. There was a man in my work gang who had been a thrall for 11 years. 11 years in the radiation zone. His name was Torval, though we called him Old Torch because of the way his skin seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. A bioluminescence born of accumulated isotopes lodged in his tissues. He should have been dead many times over. The Mechanicus servitors estimated average thrall survival at 14 months. Yet Old Torch endured, his body a map of tumors and burns and patches of smooth new skin where the radiation had killed everything and something had regrown in its place. He told me about the Ascended on my first night in the thrall barracks, his voice a wet rasp that suggested his lungs were more scar tissue than organ. "Watch your count," he said, tapping my dosimeter badge. "They track every rad you take, every last one. And when you hit the threshold, when you've absorbed enough of the engine's blessing, they come for you. They take you to become Ascended." I asked him what that meant. Where did the Ascended go? He smiled with teeth that had been replaced by small metal pegs, a gift from some long-ago engineer who had seen value in keeping him functional. Up, he said. They go up. Into the deep machinery, into the heart of her. He meant the ship. He always called the ship her, the way the Voidborn do, with a reverence that bordered on worship. I thought he was mad. I thought the radiation had cooked his brain. I did not yet understand that the radiation was not damage, it was preparation. The heat in Section 14 ran constant at temperatures that would kill an unprotected man in minutes. Our suits moderated this to merely agonizing, a persistent fever warmth that soaked through every layer and settled into the core of you. I learned to breathe shallowly, to move with economy, to never touch bare metal, because the burns would cost you fingers, and fingers were required for work and workers. Without fingers were rendered down for nutrient paste. This is not metaphor either. I saw the rendering vats. I saw what went into them. Efficiency is the cardinal virtue of the Imperium, and nothing is wasted, least of all the dead. The heat became my constant companion, my most intimate enemy. I dreamed of cold, of the frost-rimed underhive, where I had starved and shivered, and in my dreams I was grateful for the memory of numbness. But when I woke, sweating in my rack, the heat was there, waiting, patient as any predator. The counting man appeared in my 6th month. I say appeared because I had not seen him before that day, and yet the other thralls spoke of him as though he had always existed, a fixture of engine deck gamma, as permanent as the reactor cores themselves. He stood at the junction of Section 14 and the main service corridor, absolutely still, his lips moving in constant, silent enumeration. Counting, always counting. He wore a thrall's suit, but it was ancient. The fabric faded to grey and patched with materials I did not recognize, and his dosimeter badge was black, not red. Black. I did not know the badge could turn black. He looked at me as I passed with my slag cart, and his counting paused for just a moment, and he said, 4719. You hear her, don't you? You hear the engine speaking. I did not answer. I pushed my cart past him with my head down and my heart hammering against the cage of my ribs. I told myself he was mad. I told myself the radiation had destroyed him. But I had heard something, hadn't I? In the depths of my shifts, in the moments when the heat became a kind of trance, I had heard a rhythm beneath the hum, a pattern that almost resolved into meaning. The work continued. Days bled into weeks, bled into months. I learned the geography of the engine deck the way a blind man learns a room, by touch and temperature, and the particular quality of radiation that each section emitted. Section 14 was my home territory, but we rotated through other assignments as attrition demanded. Section 9, where the plasma manifolds required constant recalibration by teams of thralls who held the components in place while engineers performed their sacred maintenance rituals. Section 22, where the coolant pipes ran so hot that we worked in shifts of 10 minutes, sprinting in to perform a single task before sprinting out, our suits smoking. Section 3, which we called the graveyard, where failed equipment was stored, and where thralls went to die when their bodies finally surrendered. I saw many die. I stopped counting after the first 100. You cannot count the dead on an engine deck. They are as numerous as the bolts that hold the ship together, and equally unremarked. My body began to change in the 8th month. The first sign was my hair, which fell out in clumps that I found on my pillow, on my shoulders, drifting in the recycled air like grey snow. Then the nausea, constant and low grade, a seasickness that had nothing to do with the ship's motion and everything to do with my cells, forgetting how to replicate correctly. Then the sores, small at first, pinprick lesions that wept clear fluid and refused to heal. The Medicae servitors examined me with their clicking scanner limbs and pronounced me within acceptable parameters. Acceptable. I was rotting from the inside, and this was acceptable, because I could still work, still push my cart, still shovel slag, still stand in the killing light and absorb my daily ration of death. My dosimeter badge had been orange for weeks. It was beginning to shade toward red. I watched it change color the way a man watches a sunset, knowing that darkness follows, knowing there is nothing to be done. Old Torch found me in the barracks one night, staring at my badge in the dim emergency lighting. He sat beside me on my rack, his glowing skin casting strange shadows, and he told me about the deep core. Every thrall knew of it, the central chamber where the primary reactor sat enthroned in its housing of lead and adamantine, where the radiation was so intense that nothing biological could survive exposure. Nothing was supposed to enter the deep core except the most heavily shielded servitors and the Enginsias in their blessed armor. But Torch told me there were thralls in there, thralls who had ascended. "I've seen them," he whispered, and his eyes were bright with something that might have been fever or might have been faith. Through the observation ports, when I was on monitoring duty. Shapes moving in the light. They don't need suits anymore. They don't need anything. They've become part of her. I asked him if he wanted to ascend. He was quiet for a long time. "I'm close," he finally said. "My count is almost there. Another month, maybe 2, and then I'll know. I'll finally know what she wants from us." He reached out and touched my badge, his fingertip leaving a faint smear of bioluminescent residue on the reactive fabric. "You're closer than you think." 4719. "She's been watching you. The engine knows your name, even if you've forgotten it." The counting man began following me. Not physically, he remained at his junction, his lips forever moving, but his attention followed me. A pressure I could feel between my shoulder blades whenever I passed his station. He spoke to me more frequently now. Fragments of information that made no sense. Numbers, mostly. Figures that he claimed represented radiation absorption rates, conversion thresholds, the precise amount of isotope saturation required to trigger what he called the becoming. I tried to ignore him. I tried to focus on my work, my cart, my slag, but the numbers lodged in my mind like splinters, and I found myself counting too, tracking my own dosimeter readings, calculating how much longer I had before I crossed whatever threshold he described. The other thralls avoided both of us now. They could see the change coming. They had seen it before, in others who had lingered too long, absorbed too much, begun to hear the engine's voice. The veterans knew that such thralls were already gone, already claimed, already more machine than man. They treated us like ghosts, because to them, we were. The ship translated through the warp in my 10th month, and the engine deck became a kind of hell that made our normal hell seem gentle. The Geller field fluctuated, which meant the radiation patterns shifted unpredictably, which meant thralls died in waves, their bodies unable to adapt to the changing frequencies of poison. I survived because I was in Section 14 when the worst fluctuations hit, and Section 14's shielding held just barely enough to keep us alive. When I emerged after the translation, my badge was red, solid, unmistakable red. The shift overseer noted it in his log, but this time he did not send me back to work. He made a notation I could not read, consulted a data slate, and told me to report to the threshold chamber for processing. I had never heard of the threshold chamber, but Old Torch had, because when I returned to the barracks to collect my few possessions, he was waiting with tears cutting tracks through the luminescent residue on his cheeks. "It's time," he said. "They're going to ascend you." The threshold chamber sat at the border between engine deck Gamma and the passage leading to the deep core. It was a small room, almost intimate, with walls lined in lead sheeting and a single chair that looked disturbingly like a throne. An engineer waited there, its robed form more machine than flesh, its face a bronze mask from which a single optical sensor gleamed red. It did not speak to me in words. It broadcast data directly to a receiver I had not known was implanted in my skull. When had that happened? During one of the Medicae examinations. During my sleep, the data was cold and precise. My radiation absorption had reached 94.7% of the required threshold for ascension conversion. I was to remain in the threshold chamber until my levels reached 100%, at which point I would be escorted to the deep core for integration. Integration. The word sat in my mind like a stone. I understood finally what it meant. I understood what the Ascended became. Not promoted, not freed, absorbed, merged, made into components of the great machine that drove this ship through the void. The thralls were not workers. We were raw materials. The radiation was not a hazard, it was a preparation process, breaking down our biology, making us compatible with integration, seasoning us like meat for the machine's consumption. I sat in that chair for 3 days. They fed me nutrient paste through a tube and collected my waste through another, and the radiation bombardment was carefully calibrated to raise my levels without killing me outright. I could feel myself changing. Not dying, that would have been a mercy, but transforming. The sores on my skin began to close, but what grew over them was not flesh, as I understood flesh. It was smooth, slightly metallic, warm to the touch, in a way that living tissue should not be. My hair did not grow back, but my scalp developed a faint pattern of ridges that I later realized were heat dissipation channels. My eyes, when I caught my reflection in the polished lead walls, were beginning to glow with the same faint luminescence that marked Old Torch. I was becoming something new, something that belonged to the engine. The counting man visited me on the 2nd day. He stood in the doorway of the threshold chamber, still counting, always counting, but he paused long enough to meet my eyes. "I was like you," he said, "before. I reached the threshold, and they brought me here, and I should have been integrated, but I heard her voice so clearly. The engine spoke to me directly, and she made me an offer. I could join the collective flesh, become part of the greater machine, lose myself in the beautiful communion of metal and meat, or I could remain outside and count, track the numbers, identify the ones who could hear her, the ones who would serve her best." He tilted his head, and I saw that beneath his ancient suit, his body had fused with cables and conduits that ran into the walls, into the ship itself. He was mobile, but only barely. He could travel between junction points where his umbilicals could reconnect. He was neither thrall nor integrated nor free. He was something else, something that the engine had made for its own purposes. "You hear her too," he said, "clearer than most. She's been watching you since your first day. She chose you for something special, 4719, something more than integration." He began counting again before I could ask what he meant, and he shuffled away, his cables dragging behind him like a bridal train. The 3rd day brought me to the threshold. I know the exact moment because the engine seer's data broadcast suddenly intensified, filling my skull with a cascade of information that felt like drowning in light. My radiation absorption had reached 100%. I was ready for integration. 2 servitors came to collect me, massive constructs that had once been human, their biological components now vestigial, their forms dominated by the machines they had become. They lifted me from the chair and carried me through doors that opened at their approach, down corridors that pulsed with heat and light, toward the heart of the ship, the deep core. I was going to see what I had only glimpsed through observation ports, what Old Torch had described in whispered reverence. I was going to meet the engine face to face, or whatever passed for a face in that marriage of plasma and metal and faith. The deep core was not what I expected. I had imagined something industrial, mechanical, a vast reactor surrounded by monitoring equipment and maintenance gantries. What I found was closer to a cathedral, a space of such immense scale that the far walls disappeared into haze and heat shimmer. The reactor itself rose at the center like an altar, its housing carved with prayers in a language older than the Imperium, its surface crawling with patterns of light that shifted and writhed like living things, and surrounding it, connected to it by thousands of cables and conduits and interfaces, were the Ascended. They had been human once. I could see traces of that humanity in the shapes of their torsos, the configuration of their limbs, the echo of faces in the smooth metal masks that had grown over their features, but they were no longer separate beings. They were organs of the engine, specialized components, serving functions I could barely comprehend: cooling, regulation, monitoring, power distribution, 1,000 tasks performed by 1,000 merged consciousnesses that had surrendered their individuality for communion with the machine. They were beautiful. They were horrifying. They were what I was about to become. The servitors brought me to an integration alcove, a recessed space in the wall fitted with connection points and injection ports, and restraints that would hold me in place during the process. An Enginseer supervised, perhaps the same one from the threshold chamber, perhaps another. I could no longer distinguish between them, and it broadcast the integration protocols directly into my mind. The process would take approximately 6 hours. My nervous system would be mapped and spliced into the ship's network. My organs would be replaced or augmented with mechanical substitutes. My consciousness would be expanded to include the engine's voice as a constant presence, a guiding intelligence that would direct my functions and receive my sensory input. I would not die. I would not exactly live. I would become something between, something useful, something that served a purpose greater than any single human existence could claim. This should have terrified me. Perhaps it would have terrified the person I had been, the child with a name I could no longer remember, the underhiver who had wept with joy at his first taste of warmth. But I was not that person anymore. The radiation had cooked away my fear, my hope, myself. What remained was ready, eager, even to surrender the burden of individuality. The integration began with fire. Not literal flame, but the sensation of burning as thousands of neural interfaces activated simultaneously, mapping the terrain of my consciousness with excruciating precision. I screamed, but the sound was lost in the greater music of the engine, the hum and roar and pulse of the reactor that would soon be my heart. Through the pain, I heard her voice for the first time, not the engine's hum, which I had grown so accustomed to, but a voice, a presence, an intelligence vast and ancient and utterly inhuman. She welcomed me. She told me my name, not my number, not my designation, but my true name, the one my mother had whispered to me in the frozen underhive, the one I had forgotten in the heat and radiation of my servitude. She had known it all along. She had kept it for me, waiting for this moment when I would be ready to receive it back. The gift of identity, offered at the precise moment identity was about to dissolve into something greater. But something went wrong, or perhaps something went right, depending on perspective. The integration faltered at 47% completion, the counting man's numbers. I realized, the ones he had whispered to me, the figures he had tracked throughout my time on the engine deck. 47% was a threshold of its own, a point where the process could branch in different directions. Most thralls proceeded smoothly to full integration, their consciousnesses absorbed into the collective, their individual selves dissolved like salt in water. But some, a tiny fraction, 1 in thousands, developed a different relationship with the engine. They became something the Enginseers called intercessors, though the thralls had another name for them. The counting man was one. I was becoming another. The integration process reversed partially, leaving me changed but not consumed, connected but not absorbed, able to hear the engine's voice clearly while retaining the boundaries of selfhood that made me me. I understood now why the counting man counted, why he tracked the numbers so obsessively. He was watching for others like himself, identifying the rare individuals who could serve as bridges between the human and the machine, who could translate the engine's desires into forms that thralls could understand. They pulled me from the integration alcove at 52% completion, when it became clear that the process had stabilized at a new configuration. I was neither thrall nor ascended nor fully human. My body bore the marks of partial integration cables emerging from my spine, heat dissipation ridges across my scalp and shoulders, optical enhancements that let me see in spectrums no human eye could perceive. But my consciousness remained my own, augmented but not consumed. I could hear the engine's voice constantly now, a presence at the back of my mind that informed my every thought without controlling it. She was pleased with me, the engine. She had wanted this outcome. She had guided my radiation absorption, my transformation, my selection, all toward this purpose: to create another intercessor, another bridge, Another voice that could speak her needs to the human crew who maintained her functions without understanding her nature. The counting man met me outside the deep core, his face illuminated by the glow of reactor light spilling through the closing doors. "Welcome, brother," he said, and for the first time since I had known him, he stopped counting. "Now you understand. Now you hear what I hear. Now you serve as I serve." He showed me the observation ports, the viewing galleries where I would stand in coming years, watching new thralls arrive, tracking their radiation absorption, identifying which among them might become ascended and which might join our small brotherhood of bridges. He showed me the communication nodes where intercessors interfaced with the ship's systems, translating the engine's vast desires into specific instructions for the engine seers. He showed me the sleeping alcoves where we could rest our hybrid bodies, connected to power feeds that sustained our mechanical components while our biological remnants regenerated. This was my life now. This would be my purpose, until the ship itself finally died, millennia hence, consumed at last by the void it had traversed so long. I found Old Torch on my first day as an intercessor. He had reached his own threshold while I was in the deep core, and his integration had preceded normally full absorption, complete dissolution, consciousness merged with the collective. I recognized him only by the particular quality of luminescence his biological remnants still emitted, that faint glow that had earned him his name among the thralls. He was part of the engine now, literally. His body merged with a coolant regulation node in Section 14, the section where we had first worked together, where he had told me about the Ascended. I stood at the observation port and watched the smooth metal shape that had been his face, and I felt the engine's presence shift to accommodate my grief. She did not understand sorrow, not the way humans do, but she recognized its utility, its role in motivating the biological components she had claimed. She allowed me my moment of mourning. It was, in her calculation, efficient to permit such emotional processing before reassigning an intercessor to active duty. The years passed. I lost count of them, eventually ironic. For one who had inherited the counting man's role, new thralls arrived in endless streams, pressed from hive worlds and prison colonies and refugee ships, delivered into the heat and light of engine deck Gamma to begin their own journeys toward the threshold. I watched them. I tracked their numbers. I identified the rare few who might hear the engine's voice clearly enough to become intercessors, and I marked them for special monitoring, as I had been marked, as the counting man had marked me. Most proceeded to integration without incident, their consciousnesses joining the greater whole, their bodies becoming components of the beautiful machine that I served. A few died before reaching threshold accidents, failures, bodies that simply could not endure the radiation long enough to complete their transformation. The engine mourned these in her fashion, not for the individuals lost, but for the resources wasted, the potential unrealized. Efficiency. Always efficiency. I am writing this account in a maintenance shaft between Section 14 and the deep core, using a data stylus I acquired from a deceased engine seer to inscribe words directly into the ship's memory substrate. The engine knows I am doing this. She permits it because she understands, in her vast and alien way, that humans require narrative to make sense of their existence. She believes this account will be useful, a tool for acclimatizing new thralls, perhaps, or a historical record for the Adeptus Mechanicus analysts who occasionally audit engine deck operations. She does not understand that I am also writing for myself, for the remnants of the person I was before the radiation and the integration and the years of service. I am writing so that some part of me will persist beyond the day when my hybrid body finally fails and my consciousness completes its long-delayed absorption into the collective. I am writing because I remember my name now, the name the engine gave back to me, and I want that name to exist somewhere outside the vast machinery of her memory. My name was Sierra. My mother called me Sierra in the frozen depths of Hive Tertius, before the press gangs came, before the ship claimed me for her own purposes. I was 7 years old when they took me. I am something older now. Something measured not in years but in radiation counts and integration percentages and the number of thralls I have watched transform into components. The heat that once seemed like paradise has become my natural environment. I cannot survive without it now. My hybrid biology dependent on the constant warmth of the engine's breath. The dosimeter badge I still wear out of habit has been black for longer than I can calculate. I stand at my junction point, as the counting man stood before me, and I count the thralls as they pass, measuring their absorption, predicting their futures. Most will become ascended, a few will die, and one in thousands, perhaps, will hear her voice as I heard it, and will join my dwindling brotherhood of bridges. The engine is speaking to me now. As she always speaks, her voice a constant presence in the space where my thoughts form. She is telling me about a new thrall who arrived in yesterday's consignment, a young man from an agri world whose radiation absorption is proceeding at an unusual rate. She believes he may be a candidate for intercessor conversion. She wants me to monitor him, to track his numbers, to guide his development toward the threshold that will determine his fate. I will do this because it is my function, because I have no other purpose, because the woman I was before is less real to me now than the vast machine I serve. But I will also remember his name, if I can learn it, and I will speak that name to the engine when she asks, and I will hope. Though hope is an inefficiency I should have abandoned long ago, that he finds what I found in the heart of this ship, a purpose vast enough to fill the void where selfhood used to be, a communion that transcends the boundaries of meat and metal, a warmth that endures beyond the death of the flesh that first welcomed it. This is what it means to live inside the radiation zone. This is what the brutal life of a Voidship engine thrall becomes, for those who survive long enough to ascend, for those rare few who hear the engine's voice and are changed by it without being consumed. We are the bridge between the human and the divine, the biological and the mechanical, the brief, flickering candles, and the eternal furnace that burns at the heart of all Imperial vessels. We count the dead because someone must. We welcome the new thralls because someone must. We serve the engine because she is beautiful in her brutality, because her purpose is greater than any single human life, because in the warmth of her embrace we have found something that almost feels like love. My name was Sarah. My name is 4719. My name is Intercessor Gamma 7, Voice of the Engine, Counter of the Dead. All of these names are true. All of these names are mine. And when my hybrid body finally fails, when my consciousness completes its long journey into the collective, perhaps some thrall, yet unborn, will find these words and speak my names aloud, and for a moment I will exist again, separate, individual, human. The heat is beautiful here. In the heart of her, the heat is all I have ever wanted. The heat is home.